Hello, everyone. Greetings and welcome. Welcome to this launch of this very exciting new report, Understanding Australian Readers' Behavioural Insights into Recreational Readers. Lovely to see all the little emojis and the hearts and the little thumbs and the claps coming up. There's about 1,500 of you filtering into this room right now, which is fantastic to see so much energy and love for reading and for the really passionate cause of what can we do to get more Australians reading. So thank you for joining. My name is Anna Burkey. I'm the head of Australia Reads, and it is a real pleasure to have you here today. I am calling you here from Wurundjeri country as part of the Kulin Nation, and a lot of the work that has been done on this particular piece of research has been done on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. So I pay my respects to those elders in that country, elders past and present, and those elders yet to come. And I would also like to acknowledge the elders of lands all across the country from where many of you are watching. So while people join the room, I thought it might be nice if you can pop into the Zoom chat function. So that's the little speech bubble icon, the chat function. And you can say hello and maybe let us know what country you're coming from, so we get that sense of where everyone from all around Australia. So I can see there's a few of you there from Corona country. That's lovely to see where everybody is coming from. So welcome. Welcome on behalf of Australia Reads. Australia Reads is a national initiative that is focused on increasing reading rates. And we are a collaboration. We are educators, booksellers, librarians, publishers, authors, all of us passionate crew and many more who really believe in reading. So lovely to see where you're all coming from. I've got a little bit of housekeeping to run through before we really kick off today's session. First of all, I am driving the slides. So if sometimes my eyes go slightly glassy for a second, I'm just working out, making sure we get the right slide. So today, I'd very much like to thank our funders and supporters of Australia Reads. This particular project and piece of research has been made possible thanks to RISE funding provided by the Federal Office for the Arts, and we get a great deal of support for Australia Reads from Creative Australia. Our key founding partners are the Australian Publishers Association, the Australian Libraries and Information Association, the Australian Society of Authors, and Book People, the Booksellers Association. And we have a much wider range of partners who come and get involved in other Australia Reads initiatives. So thank you to all of you who are watching, and thank you for your support of reading. So our housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded, and I can see the little recording sign is on, and a captioned version will be made available next week. That Zoom chat function, feel free to talk to one another in that Zoom chat and have a bit of a conversation. We love that. The Q&A function, however, is what we will specifically use at question time. So you will see the little Q&A function that comes up in the bottom of your Zoom window. That gives you the opportunity to ask specific questions. And we do encourage questions and comments. If we're not going to be able to answer them today, it does give us a really good sense of what follow-up sessions we might need to run, or what news articles, blogs, or resources we might need to build. So do keep those questions coming in. And there's also the opportunity to keep in touch with Australia Reads and with our partners, BehaviouRworks Australia, as part of Monash. So if you want to do the old-fashioned multi-screen and use your phone to take a photograph of the QR code on the screen, you can get straight into the various newsletters, or you can do it the traditional way of going to the various websites for Australia Reads and BehaviouRworks Australia. So we've got a packed session for today, and just a little bit of what to expect that we're going to see. So I'm going to set the scene for what has got us to this point and what reading rates and that big picture is like for Australian reading rates at present. I'm then going to really dig in and get as much time as possible with our lead researcher, Dr. Breanna Wright, to talk about the key findings of this major report. Hopefully you've all had the opportunity to download a copy. I do not expect any but the very keenest of beans to have read it overnight, but it is a substantial report, and we have made all of the findings and all of the data associated with it available on the websites. So I will set the scene. We'll unpack in detail with Breanna. Towards the end of that first hour with Breanna, or in about 45 minutes time, we'll start feeding in audience questions. So get those coming through the Q&A function. I can't see any yet, but I'll be keeping an eye out. And then we'll have a very brief break. It says 5 minutes. It's going to be just 3 minutes. And then we will come back with our industry panel. So we have a really fantastic panel of your colleagues and peers to give a sort of first response to what we can do as a sector with all of this amazing information that the BehaviourWorks team are providing for us. So that's kind of what to expect from the day. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Now, I think we should probably introduce at this point. I think we'll introduce Breanna into the chat. So hello, Breanna.
Hi, Anna. So excited to be here today.
It is really good to have you. We've been working together for a long time on this, so it's really good to have you at this moment. Breanna is the lead researcher on this particular project. And so, Breanna, just before you and I get into a deep conversation, I thought what I'm going to do is give everyone a bit of a sense of where we've got to, or why we have got to this point. So the current state of reading in Australia, I'm sure many of you are here because you are aware of the data that talks about how between 25 and as much as 30% of Australians didn't read or listen to a single book in a year. Now that can be pretty disheartening, but I think hopefully today we'll show that there's opportunity for hope and progress. But that data that is out there in the world also shows that Australia is lagging behind international counterparts when it comes to recreational reading. So reading is on the slide on a recreational basis in a lot of Western countries around the world. Even highly literate countries like Iceland, who I think have about 93% literacy rate, are struggling with a bit of a drop-off in reading. So Australia is not alone in this particular issue. And we do have a lot of those kind of big headline stats that give us that information around a third of Australians not reading. What we really want is to be able to understand, well, what's happening there, what's going on with that particular statistic. So some of you might have heard me talk in the past about how what these big population surveys, great, really useful surveys like the National Arts Participation Survey and the Australian Bureau of Statistics have shown us is that broadly speaking, about 40% of Australians read pretty regularly. 30%, there's that kind of danger number where 30% of Australians didn't read at all in the last year. And then we've got our infrequent readers. Our infrequent readers who are kind of middle block, about 30% who might read from time to time. So there we go. That's the kind of buckets. But what we don't really know is what's going on inside those buckets. We don't really have a strong sense of what we can do about it. Are those entrenched non-readers? Have we lost them forever? Or can we bring them back to reading? And what about those infrequent readers? How often are they reading? What are their attitudes and emotions associated with reading? So that's really where we have got to at the moment. We want to change this story by understanding what's happening from this kind of macro level. And that is where today's research has come from. So we want to unpack so that we can do something about it. So Australia Reads has teamed up with BehaviourWorks Australia to try and fill this knowledge gap. And we had 3 real aims for this particular piece of research. We want to understand the decisions and behaviours that influence how and when people read. We want to map what goes on as reading behaviours. What is the reading journey and what happens along that way? We want to examine the specific drivers and barriers faced by different groups. And we're particularly trying to find out what's happening with those who read a bit less often. Today is really the next chapter of a conversation that's been going for many years. and that will continue beyond today. And so we hope from this session today, you can get some takeaways of what you can do in your community or your workplace or your professional setting that's going to help encourage more people to read. And also as a whole of sector, we can start taking a look at this data to think about what are the major national programs and reading campaigns that could use these insights. How might we design them to make a change on those big numbers of reading rates? So that tells us a little bit about how we got here. But Breanna, it's good to have you with us. I'm hoping you can give us a bit of a sense. I keep saying behavioural journey and behavioural insights. I'm hoping you can give me a bit of a sense of who BehaviourWorks are and what you do.
Yes, of course. So BehaviourWorks Australia is based at Monash University. We're an applied behaviour change organisation, which means we take academic evidence and theories and frameworks from behavioural science and psychology and sociology, and we use that to try and unpack and design solutions for real-world problems, in this case, recreational reading. So we have a method that we use to unpack problems, to understand what might be contributing to it. We deep dive into behaviours to understand specific drivers and barriers to why people may or may not do things. And then we use those insights to understand what types of strategies are most likely to be effective. And because we're academics, we also like to test and evaluate things and get some data on what works and what doesn't. So I worked with a great team at BehaviourWorks on this project, Elise Lennox and Fernanda Matta, and we essentially unpacked the problem in partnership with Australia Reads. And now we have lots of data that tells us more about what we might be able to do.
Thank you very much, Breanna. It's good to have you working on this. And this is a different kind of survey. So when I was mentioning earlier, we talked about these kind of big buckets, these really big important surveys that give us benchmarks for how Australia is doing, against other countries in the world. We took quite a different approach with this particular piece of work, didn't we?
Yes, absolutely. So as you mentioned, there are other surveys that are establishing those kind of overarching reading rates and how much people report they're engaging with recreational reading. So we kind of know what's going on, those really broad trends. What we wanted to do was get really kind of deep, nuanced data to help us understand the problem better. So what we did in this survey was, one, break down reading into lots of different behaviours so that we could be really specific and tease things apart. And then we explored kind of the motivations and the opportunity that people have to engage with reading, and really kind of teased apart those behavioural drivers and barriers. So it's a very different approach to previous surveys that we've seen about reading.
And the word reading, that's another definition that we use an awful lot. And we've got various versions. We call it recreational reading. We call it leisure reading. What does this particular project, how do we define reading?
Yes, and I know you and I have had quite a few conversations about leisure versus recreation. Anyway, so in terms of how we defined reading within this project and within the report, we included all forms of reading relating to reading in print, so hard copies, reading on ebooks on digital devices, and also listening to audiobooks. So all of those were included in what we counted as reading. We defined recreational reading as reading that was done for pleasure and relaxation, as opposed to reading that might be done for educational or professional purposes. And just one final note, we didn't include reading newspapers and magazines.
And age group wise, this study that you have to draw boundaries around various kinds of studies, and this one is age 16 plus.
That's right. Whilst we're very keen to understand younger reading, we did have to kind of draw a boundary around how much we could do in one survey. And so that 16 plus was what we focused on. People who have kind of a little bit more agency to decide what they're reading and aren't relying on another person to help them get books, for example.
And that would be quite a different methodology, and there'd be different ethics, and there'd be a whole different kind of approach, which we hope we can look at in the future. But for our colleagues who work with younger readers, I think there's still an awful lot of insights that can be useful that's in this report that influences the adults that have such an impact on young readers. And we do mention young readers from time to time along the way. Just kind of, we will flag that when we get to those particular moments. So reading, we've defined reading a little bit, but what about reading behaviours? It's a very kind of particular word, and you're a behavioural scientist, Breanna. So what do we mean when we talk about reading as a behaviour?
Yes, so those of you who have had a chance to look at the report will have seen that we have broken reading down, because if we want to understand what we can do to change people's reading behaviours, we want to be quite specific about understanding where people might be experiencing barriers. So instead of just thinking about reading as a big bucket of lots of behaviours, we broke it down into 5 more specific behaviours. Sorry, I said 5. There's technically 6, but we think of the 6 as a little bit different. So I'll explain that in a moment. So the first thing you have to do is find books that you want to read. You can't read something that you haven't found yet. It's quite difficult. Once you've kind of found, and that phase is really kind of what we might traditionally think of as like browsing for books, exploring, finding different things that pique your interest. You then have to also choose the next book that you want to read. So you have to make a commitment or some kind of decision about a particular book. You then have to get the book in some form, whether you're getting a hard copy from a bookshop or a library, whether you're downloading it, and whether you're getting an ebook or an audio book. But you have to get it in some way. You have to have access to the book. You then have to start reading. And that's the behaviour that probably people traditionally think of as what we mean by reading, is when you actually open it up or press play and start engaging with the content. The 5th step is also technically optional, which is continuing to read. After that first session of starting the book, you have to choose to keep going and, you know, ideally potentially finish the book. But you don't have to do that step. And certainly one of the things that we explored in the report is the extent to which people might stop reading for different reasons. And the final kind of behavioural, it's actually a series of behaviours we group together, is kind of reflecting and sharing after you've read a book. And that involves all of those behaviours around reflecting on what you learnt from the book, if you enjoyed it, what your takeaways were, talking to other people about the book, maybe recommending it to other people, writing book reviews, talking about it in a book club, etc. So there's actually a whole series of behaviours that we've technically grouped together at the end there. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention, sorry, which is really important and interesting about reading, is that whilst this is kind of a linear journey, there's a sequence to it that you could follow. You can also jump back and forth. So you might browse books, buy some books, go back to browsing more. Like, there are people out there who, you know, really enjoy that phase of just kind of collecting lots of books that they might want to read and growing their to be read pile. So you can jump back and forth and engage in different parts of this journey at different times. And you can also engage in different steps of the journey for different books. You might be reading one book while also kind of browsing the next book that you want to read, or, you know, you've started the first book in a series and you're already wanting to download the next book, for example.
I think what we've got there for the reading journey, for any of you who have possibly worked in kind of developing digital products or websites or customer service processes, it might feel like a user experience journey map. And that's pretty much what it is, isn't it, Breanna? We've just made it reading specific so that we understand particularly those first 5 behaviours, although that reflecting and sharing is obviously of interest too. And when it comes to this research, you'll see that the main report is 92 pages long. There's supplementary data tables. I think there's a good 10 or 12 more additional research projects we could very easily do off the back of this one, and still have reports that are 100 pages of great juicy data to use. So this reading journey is really the backbone of the report. And as we start to get into the different types of readers and how we influence their behaviour, we really look at that against the reading journey, because there will be different behaviours for different groups of people at each of these stages. Someone who loves reading, like I'm sure many of us, is going to have quite a different response, emotions, attitudes, and behaviour around each of these different steps. So just to kind of draw that out a little bit further. So Breanna, given how much data, and we've got this very juicy report, maybe you could very briefly give everyone a bit of a sense of how you tackled it from a methodology point of view.
Yes, of course. So I'll keep this fairly brief and high level, but very happy to have more in-depth methodology discussions with anybody who is interested. As an academic, we do love that stuff. So essentially, we did an online survey of 1,622 Australians who are aged 16 and older. We were trying to broadly capture kind of diverse demographic groups. In terms of kind of how we approached the survey, we really wanted to understand the different behavioural drivers and barriers. So we were looking at things like motivation, opportunity, and capability. And we also broke down the drivers and barriers for each one of the steps in the reading journey. We did have different sets of questions for readers who were defined as people who had read a book in the past 12 months versus non-readers who hadn't read a book in the past 12 months. And that was for a couple of reasons, but predominantly because we were worried that non-readers might not remember the different drivers and barriers if they hadn't engaged in them recently. And we wanted to kind of maybe focus more on understanding overall why they weren't reading and what might work with them in a different way. And that's also why the segments for our non-reader categories kind of look slightly different in the report. And again, just to reiterate, the overall objective was kind of this deep dive into behaviour as opposed to establishing those kind of national reading rates. So we had a slightly different methodology and sampling approach compared to some of those other surveys. For example, some of the other surveys that you referenced at the start have had different definitions of reading compared to how we defined it. Some have looked at a mixture of leisure activities, including reading, whereas we were just focused on reading as a single activity. And there were also some differences in kind of the age cutoffs. Everybody has taken a slightly different approach to which age they start recruitment at. And so when we can kind of look at the segments, we see slightly different percentages compared to those national reading rates. And so they may change slightly if you were to use a different sampling approach. But the important thing to remember is that whilst the percentages might change slightly, the segments wouldn't. And one final note on the methodology is that when we are looking at the audience segments that we'll be presenting, they have been formed from 3 reading frequency behaviours, whereas a lot of those reading rates that you've quoted are based on a single question. So we can't kind of directly compare our audience segments to those other kind of reading frequency rates because they're created in different ways.
Yeah, so those big kind of national surveys asking things like, have you read a book in the last 12 months? Whereas we're asking things like, how long have you read for? And a much more detailed set of questions about what that kind of behavior looks like. So we can't necessarily do direct correlation, but that's okay because I think the overall findings are still applicable. Now we're talking about segments a lot, so we're going to kind of get into what we mean by segments. And just to kind of, we've got the reading journey up on screen, just kind of reiterating particularly these first 5 steps. They're going to come up again and again in this presentation, and they're really the kind of different stages that we measure all of the different segments and groups against. But let's get on to our audience segments. So Breanna, maybe you can tell us, what is audience segmentation and why is it so important?
Yes, so audience segmentation is essentially a way to break down the population, which is really broad and diverse, into groups so that we can understand things a little bit more deeply and have a more nuanced understanding, particularly kind of understanding how people in this group are similar and how they might be different to those other groups. And it gives us kind of a much more detailed understanding of different types of readers. Again, so that we can understand what strategies might be most effective if the aim is to encourage them to read more often. And so people, again, we will get to this in a moment, but people read or choose not to read for lots of different reasons, and understanding kind of like the main groups of reasons is really informative. And mostly it tells us that there's kind of no one-size-fits-all approach in terms of how to change reading behaviours. We really want to understand what barriers each particular audience segment faces.
And so, yes, so it's really critical, really, that we can understand. I think we've got some comments in the chat, a bit of discussion about, those buckets about whether people are readers or non-readers. Those aren't particularly maybe very helpful, and that's part of the point of this research, is to get into the nice juicy stuff about audience segments. So I'm going to reveal them in just a moment and put them up on screen. That we had 6 different audience segments. So we're getting a bit more nuanced now, away from those 3 buckets from the big population surveys, and this research is really looking at 6 particular types of readers that statistically are kind of very much represented across the population of 16 plus, Breanna.
Yes, exactly. So this is what came out of all of our beautiful detailed data. We have these 6 segments. The first 4 segments, our avid readers, engaged readers, ambivalent readers, and aspirational readers, came from our reader bucket. And so that comment about kind of readers versus non-readers not necessarily being very helpful is right on the money. We can see that there are, even within readers, there's a lot of variation that we'll go into. And then our lapsed readers and uninterested non-readers came from what had previously been called the non-reader group. And so each of these segments is made up of people who have differing behaviours when it comes to reading, in terms of the frequency with which they engage with reading, their intentions towards reading, and the barriers that they experience towards reading vary substantially across these segments.
So there we go. We've got up at one end of the pipeline, really, or the life cycle, we've got the avid readers. And then we go through varying different kinds of reader behaviour, and we have those kind of uninterested non-readers at the other end of the spectrum of reading attitudes and behaviours. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each of those 6 segments. Now, we are going to spend less time on the avid readers and the uninterested non-readers. Breanna, maybe you could tell us a little bit about why we'll put a bit less focus on them.
Yes, so I think I'll explain this in a little bit more detail later on, but essentially once we had all of these segments, we then did what we call prioritization, which is kind of deciding where we might want to spend our focus and our resources to have the biggest impact. And essentially those 2 groups on each end were identified as being less likely to increase their reading frequency behaviours, and less likely to see a significant impact in terms of change.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a quick look at our avid reader segment.
Yes, so our avid readers is, again, probably what the industry has traditionally thought of as the avid reader. They read a lot. They read daily or at least multiple times a week, and they frequently start new books. So they finish a book, they're straight on to the next one. They don't have a gap between how much they plan to read and how much they actually read. So weird for behaviour. They don't actually have an intention behaviour gap. In terms of demographic, there were more women in this group. They tended to be a little bit older, maybe retired, and they were more likely to either be living alone or with a partner. And in terms of barriers, they had none. They had the motivation, the ability, and the opportunity to read. They make time for it, and they do it a lot.
And I've just heard someone say on the chat, that's my mum. I'm pretty sure we're all having a picture in our head, whether it's of ourselves or of someone we know who fits that category of the avid reader. So those keep them in mind. Those are our avid readers. And what we're showing you here is a very, very brief snapshot of what is in the report. So there's a lot more detail about each of these particular segments in the report. And if you are a complete data nerd, like I have become, you can also read additional insights in the appendix and the full data tables that are available on the Australia Reads website. So there is lots more information about the avid readers to be found in there. But let's come on now to the engaged readers, that second category.
Yes, so our engaged readers still read quite often, often still multiple times a week. But the key thing that differentiates them from our avid readers is they want to read more. So even though they're reading frequently, they would like to increase how much they're reading. But they struggle with motivation. They tend to get distracted by other leisure activity. And so they do have these barriers around kind of competing priorities, and they report that, they don't always have the time for the reading that they want to do. They tend to be highly educated and kind of middle-aged.
So I suspect that our audience is going to be resonating with a few of those as well. I feel like I'm one of these, and then I read some of the behaviours and characteristics and think, oh, I think that was maybe me a few years back. I'm not sure. I don't know if I fit in this category at the moment. So let's take a look. So these two categories, our avid and our engaged readers, are still they're all reading quite a lot. They're probably pretty familiar humans coming into our bookshops, our libraries, part of our schools, familiar to us. Now let's take a look at some of those readers who are a little bit less engaged. Introduce these ambivalent readers for us, Breanna.
Yes, this is one of my favourite segments from a behavioural perspective because they're just really fascinating. They had really inconsistent habits in terms of reading of frequency. That was quite scattered in terms of how often they read. And interestingly, they're not yet sure if they really enjoy reading. They're kind of on the fence about how much they enjoy it and how much they want to do it. They don't know if they want to prioritise reading. So essentially, this is quite an undecided group. And they tend to be a bit younger. There are more men represented in this group. Their challenges around, they're just not sure how much interest they have in reading. They struggle to necessarily find books that they thought would interest them. And so they kind of have this real ambivalent motivation around, should I do this? Should I prioritize it? How much do I want to do it? Which is a really interesting opportunity from a behavioural perspective about how can we nudge them into maybe being our engaged readers instead of on the fence.
And I think that's such a critical question for this group, and part of what we're also keen to learn is okay, that's what's going on for them. There's probably so much we could do to just move them along the reading journey and work out which bits of the reading journey they're comfortable with and where they get stuck. So we might come back to that in a moment. Ambivalent being a word that we threw around a whole bunch of words to call this group, and it's the word we just kept coming back to. They just don't know.
Yes, they were hard to describe though.
Whereas our next group are aspirational readers, a little bit easier for us.
Yes, so these guys are not currently reading that much. It's, maybe every month, but maybe just a few times a year, but they want to read more. There's a big gap between how much they would like to be reading and how much they're currently reading, but they face lots of challenges, of course. They lack the time, they struggle with distractions, it's difficult for them to stay motivated. And so in terms of demographics, again, they're kind of in that younger to middle age group. They tend to be higher earners, a lot of kind of full-time employees. So they do struggle with those time constraints on their leisure time. And again, that's where kind of those competing priorities become a problem as well. But the key takeaway for this group is that they want to read more. So we've got to make it easy for them.
Which is, again, a nice message of hope. These people might not be reading, but they want to. We can get to them. So let's take a look now at some of our non-reading categories, because they are not just one homogenous group, the non-readers.
No, so we ended up splitting, that non-reader category, somebody who hasn't read a book in the past 12 months, into two segments. The first segment is our lapsed readers. These people used to read more, but they've lapsed into not reading very frequently, but they have really positive memories about reading experiences, and they tend to have positive attitudes towards reading. So they're reading less than they want to. They, of course, experienced some challenges in engaging with reading. They reported that focus and concentration was a bit of a problem. Some of them also had some reading skills challenges that they were facing. They also were struggling to find books that interested them and lacked time to engage with reading. But interestingly, they had quite a fairly balanced spread across kind of demographic groups. So demographically, they were quite evenly distributed. And I think now would be a good point just to also mention that because these segments are based on people's behaviour, as opposed to other types of approaches like demographic segmentation, it means that people can move between the different segments, especially if you look at somebody's life course. It's very likely that people will shift between different segments. And I'm sure all of the audience today can probably think, oh yeah, I used to be an aspirational reader and now maybe I'm an engaged reader, for example. And so I think, these lapsed readers are reporting that they used to be probably in one of those other categories, but they've just slipped into reading less frequently.
And it's okay. And they have a positive attitude and memory of books as well, which was something that I found really useful and helpful to see in the data.
Yes, and importantly, they want to read again. It's not something they're saying, oh yeah, I'm not doing it currently and I don't really care if I start again. They do want to re-engage with reading.
Yeah, so really lovely to see that percentage of our non-readers do want to read again. Whereas we do have down right on the opposite end of the spectrum from our avid readers, we have our simply uninterested non-readers.
Yes, so Anna and I have discussed a few times that, reading is not always going to be for everybody. 100% of the population aren't going to be avid readers. And this segment does represent those people who lack interest in reading. They don't read for recreation, and they have a general lack of interest in engaging with reading. They tend to think other leisure activities are much more important and a better way to spend their leisure time. They tended to be just quite indifferent to reading. They weren't necessarily that negative about, they didn't say reading is terrible for people or anything like that, but they generally kind of reported that they were indifferent to it or potentially found it boring. And they did find reading difficult compared to our other segments. So they kind of faced reading skills challenges and concentration challenges related to reading. They tended to be, again, kind of younger to middle aged. There were quite a few males in this group, and a lot were working full time.
And one of the things that I found really, illuminating, although this study was looking at kind of 16 plus, is what it suggests around how important it is to embed a reading culture early, because 0% of this group could remember a single positive experience with a book ever in their whole lives. And as researchers, Breanna, you don't like 0%, do you?
Well, it's not just that we don't like it. We rarely see it. It's incredibly unusual for 0 or 100% of a whole group to report the exact same thing. we normally see a bit more variation. And in the other segments, we see that variation. Whereas the fact that 0% of this segment can recall a positive reading experience, I think is just a really telling statistic, and really embeds like the importance of those early formative reading experiences for people. So whilst we weren't looking at children and even really adolescents in this report, we have this finding about how important reading in children and adolescents is.
So now that we've had a brief look at all the individual segments, I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and bring up Breanna and I, because we think it'd be good to know who we've got in the room. So now that we have introduced all of those segments, I think this is the moment we should be able to get a poll coming up in front of you just now to say, what kind of reader do you think you are? Which category do you think you fall into at this point in your life, bearing in mind that, you know, maybe it was different at some other point. So we'll just keep that up on the screen just a moment, just a little bit of fun to see what kind of reader you are, because we're going to switch on now and talk about, well, what are the barriers for these different groups and how are we going to reach them? So if you have downloaded the whole report, you'll start to be able to see for each of the different segments, we have gone and looked at across the reading journey at each stage for each of these 6 segments, what are the drivers and what are the barriers? So in the finding books section, for example, we're looking at how people find the books that they want to read. Whereas getting books, that's things to do with availability. That's where pricing sits and attitudes to pricing. That's where knowing what book you want to reach is. And so there's a lot more detail on each of the segments so that we can move into what we do about it. And we're still getting lots of questions about why we're just looking at 16 over. We can only we hope that a future report will look at a larger, a future report will be able to do the next piece of work, which is looking at under 16s. We're using quite a different methodology, but at this stage we're focused on 16 plus. So let's take that poll down now and we'll see, can we get the results for that poll come up, and we'll see what we've got in the room. Okay, we've got a whole range. Okay, I thought we would have slightly more avid readers, but we've got avid, engaged, ambivalent, aspirational, lapsed, and perhaps unsurprisingly, you do not have any uninterested non-readers in this particular group. So that's good to have a sense of who we have in the room, but as we think about our communities and those we work with, what would that kind of makeup look like? What would those percentages look like in your workplace or setting or for the groups that you're trying to reach? Just food for thought there. So we've got the reading journey, Breanna, and we've got these reading segments. How do we put the two together? I know that there are very particular parts of behavioural science that we can really think about here. So maybe we look at the model of behaviour next.
Yes, so we used a theory of behaviour called the COM-B model, which we can put a slide up about. Again, anybody who wants to chat about this in more detail than we have time for now, I'm very happy to have those conversations. But very quickly, this involves kind of breaking down the drivers of behaviour into 3 categories. So we have capability, which is somebody's kind of ability to engage in a behaviour. That can be both physically and psychologically. We have their motivation, so how much somebody wants to engage in a behaviour. This includes also like the attitude that they have towards the behaviour, and you know, if people around them are endorsing that behaviour as well. And then we have opportunity. So, you know, do people actually have the opportunity to engage in the behaviour? So that obviously involves your time constraints that people experience, along with other kind of access issues, you know, if people can find books that they want to read, etc. And all of those things kind of influence the likelihood that somebody will actually do the behaviour that we're interested in. So when we were trying to get to what strategies might help, we used this model of behaviour to understand what barriers people were experiencing, along with those specific drivers and barriers along the reading journey to identify where we might need to intervene with people. And so we kind of created the segment profiles and identified the main barriers that people were experiencing within each segment. We then used this COM-B model of behaviour change, which is also associated with a behaviour change wheel, which we won't put up just because it's quite detailed. But that gives us kind of a theoretical framework for identifying the types of strategies that are evidence-based and most likely to result in a change in people's behaviour. So we used all of that information to identify different strategies that we've outlined in the report that can hopefully be used to inform programs and initiatives to target these different segments.
So I think one of the most kind of critical things for us to kind of think about at this point is that there are different interventions for the different groups. So just to kind of reiterate an earlier point, the avid readers, for example, very comfortable browsing for books, actually find it a fun and enjoyable experience. Some of our other segments find it stressful, don't find it a comfortable experience, find browsing maybe not for them. That's a barrier and a hurdle. That's something we could maybe make easier in a way specifically for that group that makes more sense, Breanna. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the drivers and the barriers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, again, like you can't read a book that you haven't found. And we found that our more frequent kind of readers are prioritizing browsing and finding books, whereas our less frequent readers, the ambivalent and aspirational readers, don't enjoy browsing for books and they don't think it's a good use of time. So if you don't think browsing for books is a good use of time, you're not going to find the books to read. You might get a book as a gift, you might get recommended something, but it really reduces the opportunity for you to find things to read.
Absolutely. And it's really important that I think a lot of what came up across the segments, particularly that are less comfortable around reading, is that they enjoy reading, they find it comforting. Comfort was the top emotion that came out, followed by kind of inspiring and curious as that the emotions associated with reading, but that for some people maybe they feel less confident about being a reader, and that's completely fine, and we must be very careful to make sure that we validate everybody's reading experience, because people can tell when they're being maybe judged a little bit.
Yes, exactly. And one of the kind of key things that came out for those less frequent readers was really normalizing that there's lots of different types of readers. And even if, you only want to engage with audiobooks, you're a reader. Absolutely. And even if you only read romance books, you're a reader. Like,
And when we say reader, sorry, Breanna, but when we say reader, I think when we talked about reading, our definition at the front, I think we've got to the point where it's so normal for us to think of reading as print books and ebooks and audiobooks that we maybe didn't spell that out. So this book very much sees audiobooks as it's reading and listening to books, and that is very much part of the experience. And in fact, audio for one of our target groups around, particularly say our ambivalent readers, audio is a great way in.
Yes, exactly. And so really want to normalize that, like, engagement with books can look lots of different ways, and kind of removing those perceived judgments that people are feeling around like how they read and what they read.
And again, it's all different for different groups. So
Yes.
we've got chat and some conversation, for example, about prizes going on. They might be fantastic for avid readers who feel really comfortable, but there is such a thing as choice overwhelm, is there not, Breanna?
Yes, so choice overload is really interesting when it comes to books. So people are really paradoxical. You would think that lots of choice is great. It might help us find things that we want, but it can actually be the exact opposite, where if we have too many choices, we might actually be so overwhelmed that we're less likely to, one, assess all of the options adequately, and even make a decision about what we might be interested in. So having too many choices, especially for infrequent readers, might actually be a barrier for them. And we might actually want to give them things like curated lists. That's like, just start with this short list of books to consider, rather than browsing 1,000 books in the library.
So when we look at all of our segments, we've got our reading journey, we've got our segments, we've got a better sense now of what they feel comfortable about, what they feel uncomfortable about, how we make things easy for them is how they're going to read at the end of the day. What were we thinking about in terms of the biggest impact that we can have, Breanna, on reading rates in this country?
Yes, so if you can just pop up the slides again.
This one?
So just wanted to very quickly pop this up because this informed kind of how we decided which segments might be the most important to focus on. This is what we call an impact likelihood matrix. It looks at how likely somebody is to engage with the behaviour versus the impact that focusing on that group could have on the problem that we're interested in. And so in terms of likelihood, we looked at all of the drivers and barriers of behaviour in terms of how motivated people were, the opportunity they had to engage, like how likely are people to engage with reading. And then we looked at how much we could have an impact in terms of increasing their reading. So we know that avid readers are reading a lot and they love reading and they are going to do it a lot. But the opportunity to have an impact on their reading is quite small, because if they're already reading daily, there's not much room for movement there. Whereas if you look at a lapsed reader who hasn't read at all in the past 12 months, the room for potential improvement or impact is very substantial. So we looked at both of these factors in terms of prioritising which groups we would want to focus on first. And so this isn't to say that we can't focus on all of the segments, but just thinking about where we might want to first direct effort. And I think if we go to the next slide, we've outlined, yes. So after doing that impact likelihood matrix, we kind of assessed each of the segments for which ones we would want to focus on first. The primary kind of target segment we've identified will be the aspirational readers. And this is for two primary reasons. They want to read more. So they've said that they are very keen to read more. And the barriers are easy, well, not easy, but like there are ways to address the barriers that they experience. And because they're reading so infrequently, there's a lot of room for impact on their behaviour. We follow that group with three other segments: our engaged readers, the ambivalent readers, and the lapsed readers, who again all kind of could read more. So engaged readers want to read more. The impact is probably less with that group because they are already reading relatively frequently. But for ambivalent readers, as I kind of mentioned before, like understanding how to just nudge them from being kind of on the fence about reading to being more positive and engaged with reading could have a substantial impact. And with our lapsed readers, they've said that they would like to re-engage with reading, and there's a huge room for improvement in terms of their reading frequency. We've identified avid readers as low opportunity for impact. As I said, you're not going to get a huge change in the behaviour in terms of frequency. And our uninterested non-readers, it's not to say that we might not be able to influence that group at all, but they are telling us that they're not interested in reading and it's not a priority for them. So it's just going to take quite a lot of effort and resource to target that group. And we might want to look at, those generational kind of factors, like really making sure we focus on positive reading experience early on. So that's a very quick summary. There's more detail in the report.
There's so much more detail in the report. We're not writing off those uninterested readers, but I think it's really important to think that with some of these groups, if together a couple of these groups, there's ambivalent and there's aspirational readers, that's almost 30% of the population. We're looking at kind of 7 or 8 million Australians in that group. So if we can change behaviour in a small percentage of some of these groups that are predisposed to want to read more, then we're coming a long way about changing those really big stats about attitudes and regularity of reading. So there's some good opportunities for us here with some of these groups. And those aspirational readers in particular, Breanna, they feel perfect for potential for growth. They don't think that books are too expensive. They feel a strong sense of accomplishment when they read a book. They're busy people, so integration into their lives, into their busy lives, felt like one of the top ways that we can help them read more.
Yes, exactly. And it's, you know, things like just how do we carve out a regular reading time for them? You know, is it a time on a weekend to start with, just to get it as part of their routine, for example? But the report does go through lots of options for how we can start encouraging them to read more often.
So let's take a quick look at effective messaging and interventions. So what are the kinds of things that we can do? And I'm going to say it yet again. These are different for different groups. And there will be some overlap, and there are generally some things that work for multiple groups, but how we might deliver this might look a bit different for different groups. So for those groups, for example, Breanna, where they say that reading is not the priority leisure activity, and there are tables in the report that show you how people feel about reading compared to other forms of entertainment and ways that they can spend their time. And you'll be heartened to hear that reading comes in, I think overall reading pretty much comes in at number 4, but again, different for different segments. But we totally beat cooking. Yeah, reading rocks. Reading not being a priority leisure activity, maybe you could give us a bit of a sense of what the kinds of interventions are that tackle that barrier.
Yes, so this barrier came up across a few of the segments where it was, you know, competing leisure activities, essentially. So here we've suggested things around promoting the enjoyment and the benefits that come from reading, because people are really positive about that. They've said that reading brings them a lot of comfort and relaxation. It gives them motivation. So we really want to remind people of that, to also help kind of overcome some of the perceived effort barriers that people experience when engaging with reading. Other ways to do this is to encourage people to set reading goals. And we want to start small, especially for infrequent readers. If you have a reader who's only reading 2 or 3 times a year, we don't want to say make it part of your daily routine. Let's set some realistic baby steps. Maybe the first step is to kind of say, hey, for your next holiday, take a book. And then, like, you know, work it into weekend routines, for example. We also, there was a strong finding throughout the report around the social influence of reading. So we want to encourage the social benefits of reading, joining and starting book clubs, and connecting with friends. Like, the more people around you who are reading and talking about books, the more that reinforces the behaviour. So connect with friends who are already reading rather than friends who are not reading, then you're both facing an uphill battle.
And that speaks to the social norms point as well, Breanna, around that makes it a social norm to read as opposed to a social norm to not read. And that's really important to reinforce, that we want to get to a sense where it's really normal to read. It's really normal to be reflecting and sharing about reading.
And it can be hard to do that because reading is sometimes quite a private, isolated activity. We might not see it that much. Like, if everybody is like me and prefers reading when they're at home alone with no distractions or people around them, then you can't see other people reading. Whereas, you know, we see people scrolling on their phones out in the world all of the time.
Well, let's talk about distractions then, Breanna, because it does come up and people do like to say, well, it's all screen's fault. And, you know, look, it's part of the picture, but it's not the screen itself. It's the behavior that's happening on the screen, such as scrolling social media, and people get distracted. And I was really interested to learn that we've actually had more leisure time now than we've ever had before. Isn't that the case?
Yes,
but
our perceptions of that leisure time do not match up with that. So we don't feel like we have that much leisure time. And that's partly because our leisure time can be quite fragmented, can be broken up across the week into small blocks. And so it might not feel like we have a lot of leisure time. And, you know, it's really easy if you've got 15 minutes to just kind of scroll through your phone, because there's not much of a commitment, or you can kind of dip in and out of it quite easily. Whereas with a book, people might think 15 minutes isn't enough time to read a whole chapter, for example. So we might need to suggest different ways to engage with reading, shorter material, or trying to encourage people to find those bigger blocks. Actually think about your schedule and find a bigger block when you can commit to reading a book.
So they were kind of some general points that came up across some of the different segments, that reading isn't necessarily a priority activity for some people. People get distracted. People aren't sure. We've already discussed what they like to read. People not feeling in the mood to read comes up as well. They have the time, they just don't feel in the mood. There's ways for us to tackle that.
Yes, so this is a really interesting one because actually there's so many different books out there that there should be a book to fit every mood. But again, this sometimes comes back to that perception that, I have to read a particular type of book or that reading is too effortful. So really promoting that message that there's so many different types of books and finding the book that you feel engaged with at that moment. So, if you feel like binge watching something a bit trashy on Netflix, there's essentially a book equivalent of something easy and accessible and light that, isn't pondering the human condition. And so really just kind of normalizing that, like, any type of book that you want to read is fine, because that then, like, there's this spillover kind of effect of, like, that might encourage you to read other books.
Yeah, we've and by reading, again, just to kind of say, we mean all different kinds of formats, and we also mean, when we're looking at frequency, we were also, there's data in the report, in the data tables about, are people stopping to read for one session? Are they doing just one session of reading a year, or are they kind of reading for just 2 or 3 minutes? So they're reading for hours at a time. So for the questions that are really interested in that kind of deep dive data, I would very much not just refer you to the report, but you might like the data tables, where there's pages of percentages and demographics around every question we asked. So we're gonna bring in our panel fairly soon, and I'm going to give everybody in a few minutes' time a little bit of a break to grab a very quick cup of tea, because we're giving you a lot of information in a very short period of time. But before we do that, Breanna, I think it'd be great if you could give us maybe just a few general points of advice. Although for our segments, we want to have a targeted approach to be able to change the behavior of different groups of people. Some of those different groups will give us a better return. There's better opportunities with some of those groups than others, but there are some sort of general things that behavioural science can point us to that can help us as well.
Yes, absolutely. So you'll all be able to see in the report the really specific interventions, but just 3 quick takeaways from behavioural science. We want to focus on the behaviour that we want people to do rather than the behaviour that we don't want people to do. So rather than telling people to put down their phones and pick up a book, we just want to focus on, downloading something onto your ebook device. As we've mentioned, social norms are really powerful, but we want to be careful in how we leverage them. We need to make sure that the people or the group that the message is coming from resonates with the particular target audience. So either needs to be somebody that they think is like them, or kind of an authority figure in some way that they have respect for.
So that might be a peer. So that's someone like me. That might be one of my peers is recommending it to me as word of mouth, or that might be a parent or a teacher, or possibly a celebrity if it's the right fit, but not necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. And lastly, as we mentioned before, trying to reduce that choice overload, especially for people who are getting back into reading or trying to increase their reading. People who work in the industry and our avid readers are so familiar with, like, the different genres and tropes and types of things that they might like in books. That can be really overwhelming when you're going back into the library or a bookstore for the first time in a year or more. And so finding ways to reduce that overwhelming aspect and trying to connect people with the material that they might enjoy in an easier way.
And one of the concepts that we've had a lot of fun with while we've been doing this report, Breanna, together, is the behaviour intention gap. So what people tell us versus what they actually do.
Exactly. And so one final comment is that, as we see, 50% of our sample want to be reading more than they do, but there's this huge gap between what we plan to do and what we think our priorities are versus our actual behavior. And so, you know, this comic is kind of the perfect representation of like 50% of people out there want to be reading more. We've just got to help them jump over those flames of like distractions and barriers to get to the fantastic outcome of reading more books.
So that's a nice moment, I think, to kind of pause for a moment. It's a huge deluge of information. If you haven't had the opportunity to go and download the report, you can do that now from the Australia Reads website. There you can download the short exec summary, but I recommend for this engaged group that you download the full report, and you can start to look at the matrix for every one of those audience segments. What are the barriers that really get in the way for that group? What are the things that we can do about it? And what are the kinds of interventions that are going to work for that group that might not work for another group? So I recommend now, Breanna and I will be back here. We're going to give you 3 minutes till 3:11. That's just enough time to hopefully grab a cup of tea or nip to the loo. And then we're going to return with our industry panel. So we're going to go through all of your questions. We'll answer as many as we can, and we'll bring our panel of industry experts back. Oh, it's 3:12 now. I'll give you till 3:12, and we'll see you back here at 3:12 p.m. 3 minutes. So let's bring back now. Our panel is going to start to join us. So excellent. Hello. I think we've got you all. So hello again, everyone. Welcome back to this launch of the Understanding Australian Readers Report presented by Australia Reads and BehaviourWorks Australia. We're going to have a bit of a conversation now with some excellent colleagues about the findings of this particular report, which did focus on age 16 plus, reading predominantly long form across ebooks, audiobooks, and print formats. And we're really looking at those reading rates and what we can do to increase and improve the declining rates of recreational reading in Australia. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel. I'll just do a bit of a run through of each of them. We have Jaye Chin-Dusting. Hello, Jaye, who is the owner of Mary Martin Bookshops in Melbourne, which was the ABIO Bookshop of the Year in 2019, is a Lord Mayor's Small Business Award finalist and winner, and is the vice president of the Booksellers Association, Book People, and has a podcast called the Booksellers Podcast. So great to have a bookseller talk about these findings. We also have Jane Cowell, who's from the libraries industry. So Jane works with Yarra Plenty Regional Libraries, but is also the president of ALIA, the Australian Library and Information Association. So is speaking today on behalf of both the public and that kind of school library context, and has also represented state libraries in the past at State Library Queensland, where she's involved in the early literacy program First Five Forever. We also have Eva Mills, who's the publishing director for books for children and young adults at Allen and Unwin. And in a previous life, I did not know this, Eva, you studied statistics as well as working in social research. So Eva has a real background in research to be able to dig into all of this material with us. But she's worked in publishing since 1999 and has been with Allen and Unwin for 20 years this year. And we'll be able to give us some insights that for our author and illustrator colleagues who are watching today as well. And we also have Justin Ratcliffe, who's currently the commercial director at the publisher Thames and Hudson, but has been in publishing for some time and has been at Penguin Random House and at Hachette. Justin, like most of us, is really passionate about readers and how we put readers at the heart of what we do, and is a previous recipient of a copyright agency fellowship looking at reader centricity in publishing from 2019. So hello, panel. How are you all doing?
Good, thank you.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, we've got you all on audio, so that's great. Excellent. I think we might have temporarily, I think we've still got Jaye with us, maybe a slight issue with video there. But hi, Jaye, are you still with us? Okay, we'll see if we can get Jaye back online. So panel, you had an enormous task where we basically threw this report at you 1 week ago and asked you to read it in depth and give us your recommendations on how this can change the future of the industry and solve reading in Australia. So it was a fairly small question we were asking you there. But I think it'd be really good to get a perspective from each of your parts of the industry on what comes next. We've presented a brief look at this very detailed report. What comes next? How do we turn this into action? So Justin, given that this was the topic of your fellowship, I think we might start with you, and it'd be really good to get a sense of how do you think this report or this kind of information could be useful to you as a publisher?
Firstly, congratulations on the report. It's a brilliant piece of work, and I'm sure will pay dividends for the industry and everyone involved in reading for years to come. I think there's lots of really interesting things about the report. Firstly, as you guys have been discussing, it deals with behaviours and not intentions or attitude, which is really important. We know that effective promotion and advertising changes people's behaviours and not just their attitudes, because, as you said, there's a big gap between the two of them. It also points out, I think, that we're only talking to, most of the time, at least 50% of our potential customer base, I guess you could call it, and that perhaps we're being preaching to the converted a little bit too much and being a little bit too targeted in our communications, and we should perhaps go for a kind of a broader reach, and also try to sell the benefits of the product rather than just the product itself. So alongside kind of selling books, sell the value of books and the value of reading, particularly at a time when we know that lots of people are feeling isolated and alienated and discontented, and know that they have these huge tech companies who are, this whole idea of attention capitalism, that attention is the kind of most valuable commodity we have out there now. And we as people who are interested in reading and want people to read more and know that it has benefits are up against this sort of huge, technological, industrial attention complex, which with a book, which if you think about it is sort of a 500-year-old technology. But we also know that that there are many, many benefits associated with reading, and our job as an industry is to try to sell that message effectively and keep selling it over and over again. Find new ways to sell the benefits of reading. I mean, I think the other great thing about this report is that it very clearly identifies a target audience, and the essence of marketing is segmenting, targeting, and positioning. And so we now have, the aspirational readers who we know are 14.87% of the potential readers out there, and we know what their barriers to reading are, and we know that there are ways that we can communicate with them to try and assist in changing their behaviours, which I think is a really exciting learning from this report, and something that as an industry we can all kind of get a hold of and focus on, because 14.5% is no small segment.
It takes us into the millions, for sure, Justin, of people that we can reach. And we had a question earlier about, are we trying to move people along the pipeline? Do we want all our aspirational readers to become avid readers? And I think that would be nice in an ideal world, but really we're just looking to nudge people along and increase their habits from where they're starting from now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things to steal your attention out there, and just getting people reading a little bit more, or devoting a little bit more time to reading, when we know that they know that it's beneficial for them, and we know that they know that they know that they spend too much time, on their phones. So it's just a question of being able to nudge them in that direction.
Yes, I like that. I like that concept of nudging them. We know we want to. We just need that little extra push to get us to do that thing that we actually really enjoy. And again, coming back to that finding from the report, that comfort was the top finding, the top emotion associated with most segments around reading.
Yeah, and I think the second one was learning and keeping your brain engaged. Right?
I was in there.
I think that's also a massive benefit. When you pick up a book that there's a degree of quality control there, and that someone's thought really hard about what they want to say and how they want to say it, and that there's a whole team of people who've worked with them to craft that. And it's not just clickbait.
It's quality, and I think we're going to see more of that as those wider trends in society around quality, trust, credibility, and the need for escapism and enjoyment that doesn't fragment your brain any further. All of those are going to be big trends that we can kind of lean into. Books are the antidote. They have the answer.
I read this thing that said creating attentional oases is
grounding
the way to
ourselves,
go. Yeah.
having a peaceful moment. Eva, is this something that's resonating for you, whether with your publisher or your statistician hat on?
No, the statistician hat is a very long time ago. Yeah, just picking up on that point about quality, I did notice that the aspirational readers, one of the barriers for them in starting to read was having a boring or confusing beginning to a book, and conversely, one of the factors in keeping them reading was having an exciting first chapter. So I did want to put in a plug for publishers continuing to invest in editorial departments, because that's one way we can get the aspirational readers in. For me, the most exciting potential for this research is to feed into industry-wide programs, picking up on a lot of what Justin's just said, to just promote reading across the board. And I would strongly encourage all publishing houses to support whatever comes next out of this in that way. I do think the aspirational readers are definitely the sweet spot for publishers, as everybody's already said. They see reading as desirable already. They don't really have a barrier to purchasing books. They don't see them as too expensive. They purchase physical books both in store and online, but they do need help finding them, and they're not very keen to spend time searching. So I think that what that immediately makes me think about is how can publishers market to those readers? And we already do a lot of this already. We already create group title or backlist promotions around things like holiday reading or fantasy bundling or whatever. But maybe we could be even more targeted. Maybe we could really look into where aspirational readers might be hanging out, who are their influencers, where do they go on their holidays, maybe give them quick and easy lists. Things like, Margot Robbie's beach reads, or the best books to make you look cool on your commute, or 5 books your boyfriend should read. There's just some of the things I scribbled down when I was reading the report. Yeah, and then also the engaged readers. I was really pleased to see that they're keen, as a children's and YA publisher, they're quite keen on YA, but also graphic novels and poetry. So that made me think, okay, they like short reads. So is there a kind of promotion around 10 short reads or books for busy parents or something like that? So I mean, none of that is rocket science, and it supports what we already know, which is that there's no one size fits all for marketing or promotion. But if you're asking specifically what publishers could do out of this research, that felt to me like the most instant action that we could potentially take. Yeah,
that's fantastic, Eva. I can see us doing the next nationwide reading campaign is books for busy parents.
Definitely.
But I think that is a really great point that you have both made around to make change at scale and to change some of these behavior patterns for large groups. We are going to need a kind of consistent language, and we're going to need to be really targeted. There might be 5 or 6 different campaigns we want for these different segments, but we're going to have to take them one at a time. And it sounds like, I love that you're already adopting the language of the aspirational readers and the avid readers. Is a shared language is probably going to be helpful as an industry, so we can all talk about who we're targeting.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that can really help with everybody being on the same page about promoting reading. Yeah.
Well, we've taken things very much from that publishing angle to kick things off. Jane, we might swing around to the library's perspective, noting that you work with and you represent lots of different kinds of librarians. And I would say that the work that is being done across the whole sector, not just libraries, for avid and engaged readers came up as keep doing it. It's going well. It's working. But maybe we can take some of those resources, maybe we're over-resourcing it, and maybe we can take some of those resources and put them into targeting some of these other segments. So Jane, coming over to you, library's perspective, what were your key thoughts when we gave you this report?
So the avid readers, obviously, sort of, it was so great to know that they loved libraries and bookshops, sort of that these were their go-to places. But one of the things that stood out for me from the avid readers is that they actually read more now. So there's a pathway, you know, that demonstrates that they didn't always read as an avid reader. I did. But, you know, but not everyone who's an avid reader now, a significant portion of them are now avid readers because they've come on the journey. So that says to me that we have a pathway for our aspirational readers to actually, you know, sort of get them, you know, reading a bit more. So that's great. And it's great that, you know, sort of, because you can use an avid reader. I didn't, you know, sort of read so much before, and this is how I fitted it in. You can actually, you know, sort of dig a bit deeper. But at the other end of the spectrum for me, and I don't know if anybody else, you know, sort of on the webinar or on the panel really felt this, but for me, not having ever had a positive experience about reading for our non-readers is incredibly sad. You know, sort of that at no point in their life have they connected with a reading experience that was good. And that says to me there's a call to action there about having a great teacher librarian, about, and you know my history with First Five Forever, Anna, but, you know, about having a great early, you know, sort of literacy experience at a library with, you know, a story time. And, you know, sort of the outreach that libraries do, you know, sort of into areas where there might not be a library, it's usually with story times to really connect young people, you know, sort of, and our young children with a really good reading experience. And I think that's amazingly important and a real call to action from this as well.
Absolutely. It really tells us that if you have seen someone around you, if you've had the behavior modeled, if you've had a good experience, and I think the good experience is really important if we think about particularly maybe we're teenagers rather than just the early years.
But a teacher librarian, you know, accessing a good teacher librarian who actually connects you with reading in a different way that, you know, doesn't judge your reading. It's not about being judged or shamed, you know, sort of, it's about how do you connect. And a young person, a dyslexic young person, they might love an audiobook. Young people love stories. They love being read to. So, you know, sort of, I think for these adults now to say they've never had one, I just find that incredibly sad.
We did also have a finding in the report that, didn't we, Breanna, around that those people who, if the people around them value reading, then they're much more likely to value reading themselves. And I think these two stats might be linked.
Yes, so we certainly saw with our avid and engaged readers that they reported those perceived social norms of people around me valuing reading. They reported those at a much higher rate than our infrequent readers, which tells, you know, suggests that like the more messages we're receiving from people around us about the value of reading, you know, we don't have directional data right now, but that would imply that, you know, it does influence our behavior.
And we did sneak in, although this report is not about is about 16 plus, we did sneak in a question about reading to others, because that might be reading, as you say, Jane, in the kind of the early years capacity, but it might be reading to an older person or an unwell person. Or my own book club is a read aloud book club where we just read to each other and there's no homework. Great. But that sense of, we asked that question of, do you read to others? And people didn't necessarily identify that as reading for themselves, but they knew that it was important to do. So even the people who didn't read for themselves did think it was important to read to others.
Yes, and you framed that.
I haven't got that quite right there, Breanna, have I?
No, you absolutely did, and you framed it really well. Like, we snuck in that question. Absolutely, we would have loved to have delved into reading to other behaviours, like we did reading for yourself. But we did have to put some barriers around how long this survey was, just so that we could make sure people got to the end of it. But we did want to just get at least some top level information about if people are reading to others and who they're reading to. So in the report, we do have a bit of a breakdown about how many people read to others, if they're reading to their children or somebody else they care for, and kind of some basic demographic breakdowns, which just starts to paint a little bit of a picture about how people engage with reading to others versus reading to themselves. And interestingly, they don't necessarily count that as reading, whereas I definitely count the books that I read to my kids every night as reading. That absolutely goes into my reading time calculator. And, you know, there are still lots of benefits to reading to others, and maybe people aren't perceiving those benefits. And maybe they're viewing it as a chore because they're time pressured and tired when they're doing it, versus something that, you know, is about connection and enjoyment, for example. So there's a lot of potential in that space as well, and hopefully we can dive into it.
So I did say we snuck in that question. There are a lot of questions. If you are interested in demographic breakdowns, if you're interested in kind of the full detail of the emotions, of the activities that various groups are doing, this has all been cut versus demographics, but it's also been cut versus whether people are readers or non-readers or which segment they're in. Go and have a good look at those data tables. What we've put in the segment profiles are the most important factors that are going to be influence how we change and nudge, to use Justin's word, people's behavior. So there are very extensive versions of these audience segments. What we've got in the kind of summary and the drivers and barriers are the most pertinent points around how we're going to change and influence how they act and behave. So, Jane, it feels like libraries with the enormous network of at least 1/3 of Australians being members of a public library, a pretty good place to start.
Absolutely. And, you know, I also really picked out that, you know, sort of some of the messaging, you know, sort of around for our aspirational readers. And Justin, you actually talked about it, but reading is fun. Like, so yes, it's good for you. So don't make it like you have to take a pill, but, you know, sort of actually reading is fun. So how do we remind our aspirational readers that it's fun, you know, sort of, and, you know, some of the things, you know, sort of can be done with a group, you know, sort of that social book club, you know, sort of reading aloud so you have no homework, a bit of, you know, sort of having a beverage with, you know, sort of with you, and also about finding your book place, you know, sort of where's your book nook, where's your comfort, where are you taking that time for yourself? I of course love a shut up and read party, you know, sort of, and, you know, sort of, and again, it comes with social, you know, sort of a bit of quiet time and a beverage. So, you know, sort of where is that comfort? So it's really about reminding aspirational readers that it's not a chore, you know, sort of, and how do we actually think about that, you know, sort of making it a bit more fun. I mean, it's fun for us avid readers, but, you know, how do we actually think about making it more fun?
And we might need to get a little out of our own comfort zones and think about, well, fun for other people might look different than fun looks to us.
That's right.
We might need to express that quite differently. And I think, Jane, that point really nicely picks up on kind of what Breanna was saying, is lean into the behaviors we want to see. It is fun. It is enjoyable. Let's focus the message on that, and not any of the kind of negative messaging or what we want to stop people doing, because that's much harder to achieve. I might bring Jaye in at this point to kind of, hello, Jaye, good to have you, to kind of look from a bookseller point of view. Like many of the librarians watching, you're interacting with readers every day. So were there particular things that chimed from these findings from what you're seeing in book buying behaviors?
I mean, I enjoyed reading it thoroughly. Congratulations, Breanna. And being the very practical person that I am, the first thing I did obviously was to look down that reading journey and to try and work out how a bookshop, our bookshop in particular, could, you know, contribute better to that reading journey. Whether we are ticking the boxes, whether we're not doing something well, whether there's something we can do better. And again, being the very practical person I am, I took it point by point. And it starts off with finding the book, for example, when you come in and you can't find a book. And I think bookshops and libraries, of course, are very important in that, being the public interface, in that a bookshop in particular, we curate very tightly. It's a small space for us. And it's as soon as you walk in, you know that this is a place where books have been curated and therefore sieved. Now, within the bookshop itself, we curate even more tightly, in that we've got a wall which contains about, I'd say, 40 books tops, which are books that the staff love. And it's not just books that Jaye and Dustin loves, it's books that 10 of us love. So that somebody who comes in would go straight to that wall, and there's a very manageable list of books to look at for the avid reader, right down to the person who hasn't read for ages. And we've got young Vasily, who's 18 years old, who only reads manga, for example, and he's got his space on the books we love wall as well. We've got, you know, all sorts of books. And generally, we find that a lot of people who come to that wall who are not really huge readers or don't like browsing the whole store as such will come in and look for, if they've enjoyed one of the books that I've read, they'll look for Jaye's book again. And in fact, we often get them to come up to the counter to say, hasn't Jaye read anything recently? I mean,
Jaye is slacking off and has become a lapsed reader.
Slacking off doing her thing.
And I think Jaye, that feeds in really nicely to some of the findings in the research around who the message comes from. So for certain audience segments, that's really powerful.
Yes.
So whether they're seeing themselves reflected on that wall, whether they're seeing someone they really trust and respect reflected, that feels like that can really work for those groups. Were there findings that you saw in this report that you thought, oh, that's something that's really going to help us in the book selling world work together?
It's more validation more than something that was completely new. I mean, a lot of the things that we do in the bookshop instinctively are instinctive. And what I really enjoyed about the report is that it gave us a lot more, data-based evidence-based data, I should say, to assure us that what we're doing is going the right direction. Another tool that we use quite often, and I should say that I've got 3 bookshops, and we treat our 3 bookshops quite differently because the demographics are different. One is in the suburb, one is in a shopping restaurant mall, and the third, which is probably the most interesting in this context, is a very small one. It's the size of it is 2 shipping containers, and it's got a wraparound veranda around it, and it's right in the middle of Queen Victoria Market. So it's a place where nobody actually expects to see a bookshop. But, so we're bringing ourselves into that audience who actually doesn't expect to see a bookshop. And, every half hour on the half hour, you'll see families go by and kids shout out in wonderment, "Oh my God, a bookshop, Mom, can I go in?" And you can tell immediately whether that family is a reading family or not. Now, our bookshop is opposite a cafe. So what usually happens with those non-reading families is they're very happy for the kids to go browse, and then they'll have a coffee. But more often, I mean, almost 100%, as soon as a kid shows an interest in the book, parents will buy it. So there is that general want to, for your kids to read, whether you're a reader or otherwise. So within that bookshop space, again, the curation is very tight because we try and have something for everyone. So we've become quite a good resource for even the residential, very avid reader. We make sure that there is the, Percival Everett's in there and the Safekeep, the Booker Prizes, Tim Winton and all that. But we also have very simple reads. And if I've got the time, I mean, this is like, I was going to bring in a prop. Can you see it?
I think I'm not sure we can. A little bit. Yeah. It's a book.
Better? It's a book. And it's called Before the Coffee Gets Cold. And it's written by a Japanese writer. So it's a translated book. The language is really simple. And when people come in and say, I haven't read for ages, I'd really like to read, but, I'm scared of all the titles. There's no way I'm recommending a Tim Winton to them or a Bee Sting to them. What I'll say is, have you seen this particular book? Do you know about it? And usually they'll say, look, I've seen the cover everywhere, but don't know what it's about. And then I let into a little story and I say, well, it's about a cafe in Japan. And if you know, you know. And if you know, you'll sit in a particular spot and the person will come with a pot of coffee and they'll pour you a pot of coffee. As they're pouring the pot of coffee, you get transported back in time. So you can go back and redeem yourself, say sorry to someone you want to say sorry to, tell someone you love them, whatever it is. But whatever you do, it doesn't change the reality of your present. And whatever you do, you need to come back before the coffee gets cold. And by that stage, they're kind of hooked into the story. And I go, if you don't come back, then there's another storyline. And the beauty of this little weapon is that it's short stories, but every chapter kind of connects because the structure connects them all. So I say you can read that chapter and put it down and come back again. And you can read the whole book and put it down. But if you want to come back again, there's this one, there's this one, this one,
That sounds like I need to be looking out for the Jaye recommends as well list. And that we've had a comment come in as well, a lovely suggestion. Someone pointing out that in some places in France there are vending machines with stories that are based on the local commute times. So 10 minutes reads, 15-minute reads. And I really love what you're doing there, Jaye, with your shop, is you're really understanding your local community and you're really tailoring what there is to those different groups and what they need.
It's important. And recognizing that, like I said, a lot of people don't come to the market to look for books. So what we do as well is blind date a book, where you wrap the book up and we pretend that basically the book is your Tinder date. And there's a little description basically to say, I am lovely and gentle, but I might probably break your heart. And that's all we say. And you can swipe left or right.
And Breanna, I suspect initiatives like that they're very particular kinds of interventions, which would work for some groups and not for the others. Exactly. So there are particular groups you think an intervention like that might work for, just to put you on the spot?
Oh, that's probably a tough question. Like the blind date with a book I've seen before, and I love the concept, but I do wonder, like, you know, for our infrequent readers, if that's too big a gamble. But on the other, maybe it works really well. So I'm so evidence-based that without like some data, I find it a little bit hard to know which way it would have fallen, because
data, Breanna.
And
what happens at the night market, for example, where basically they're young, it's a young demographic. A lot of them are not readers. They come in, maybe one in the group is a reader, and they'll say, oh my God, I got to get this. And then they get hooked into it. In a particular night, which is 5 hours long, I would sell about 50 of those blind dates.
So you've definitely got your target market really clear there, Jaye.
Exactly right. And they come back. A lot of them say, haven't read in ages, loved what you said, you know, and there's no judgmental, you know, on them at all. Yeah.
And that, again, that judgment point coming up, that's really important, that we kind of meet people where they're at and let them read and choose whatever it is that they are wanting to read and help them. And if they're not sure, that's okay too. So again, just noting that the report has, within each of the audience profiles, has a note of the different kinds of barriers and these kinds of interventions, the sorts of tactics that we can use for different kinds of different kinds of groups. So those tactics, Breanna, that we've got a little table of the different types of interventions in the report that you can use. Sometimes, for example, it's about incentives, so it might be about prizes. Sometimes it's absolutely not. Incentives are not the way to go. They're not going to work. It might just be about awareness. You need to, like Justin was saying, sell the benefits to a particular group. So we've got recommendations in there, don't we, about which kind of tactics to use in which circumstance.
That's right. And so under each segment profile, we've listed out kind of the key barriers from that segment. And then each key barrier, we have different suggestions about how you might target that barrier. So within each segment, you kind of get a list of different strategies that might help. We originally started with very long lists because there are lots of different things that you can do. So there's even more detailed lists in the appendix, just so that everybody is aware. And we've kind of prioritized them within the main body of the report. But yeah, there's even more to consider if you pop down to the appendix.
Data nerds galore. I might just briefly touch on what this might mean for our authors. So our authors are obviously creating these stories, this nonfiction, these learning materials that spark this curiosity and this desire to learn. So Justin and Eva, I think maybe from a publishing perspective, you work really closely with authors every day. Justin, is there anything that you're going to be passing on to your authors as something to think about?
It's a tough one, I guess, because, you know, authors write for all sorts of different reasons, and some of them write with an audience in mind, and some of them don't, and some of them like to engage directly with their readers, and some of them don't. So I guess it depends on the author and you know, who they're writing for. But I mean, I think definitely what I would be encouraging them and the ASA and anyone who's involved with this in the industry is to sell the benefits of what they're doing at the same time as kind of selling their work. I think that is the most useful and proactive thing that we could all be doing. And, you know, now that we've got this report and we've got this target segment, you know, to come up with a list of ways that we can target the aspirational readers and how we can, as I said, give them that nudge towards reading more, and just make sure that everyone is singing from the same song sheet and telling people what that message is. you know, whenever they have a chance to speak publicly or to friends or colleagues about their work and reading in general.
Eva,
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. I love that, Justin. I did notice that liking a particular author's work comes up consistently across all the segments, I think, as a reason to choose a particular book. So, yeah, 100% not all authors love to do this, but building an identity, finding a way to engage with your fans that feels authentic and comfortable to you as an author. Many authors already do this really well and it pays off, but now we've actually got some research to say, you know, this is a way to help readers find you and come to books. So, you know, authors who are happy to do it, they can sort of lean into whatever niche it is that they belong to, as a point of difference from other books, but also as a point of predictability for readers who like that familiarity, which it does seem like a lot of our readers in the report do. Yeah,
And
I
that
think
actually,
sorry, Breanna, it's just time poor readers actually do like predictability. They do like to know what they're going to get. Yeah.
that's such a great point, Eva. And sorry to jump in. I just wanted to highlight that we also saw that that came out when we asked people about changes in their reading frequency. And a lot of times when people were saying that they've increased their reading frequency, one of the triggers or the prompts for that was finding an author that they loved or a series that they got really into. So it does seem to be quite an important part of that.
And Jane, picking up on Justin's point around kind of advocating and us all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, you're often in spaces where you have to go and talk to various state ministers and such like, and in your role at ALIA, talking to various federal movers and shakers. Is that important? Is that really important that we have this kind of shared, clear message as an industry?
I think having the data is really important. So, you know, sort of to back that up for whatever our ask is. But one of the, you know, sort of the key things, I suppose, for governments is to realize that without a literate, you know, sort of reading population, we're not going to have very good democracy. So, you know, one of the things is about reading deeply. It's questioning. It's, you know, sort of it's actually thinking about your vote. Do you know what I mean? Like to have a, you know, sort of a really active and participatory democracy. And it's not just about voting in a federal or a state election. It's about thinking about, well, you know, sort of this park is being put up by my council. Is this what I, you know, sort of want? It's actually participating in our civic, you know, sort of life, which I think is really important for democracy. So some of that is really good. I'm not sure that talking to a federal politician about aspirational readers will cut through. So you know, so it's using the data, you know, sort of in ways to foretell and to say how this actually fulfills the state government strategy, you know, sort of a federal strategy. But for me, one of the key takeaways for libraries, and this would be building on the work, but also building, you know, sort of on our readers and that much stronger community, is that so many people come into the libraries and we're not going to know if they're an aspirational reader or an avid reader, or we will know the avid readers because they've got the 30 overdues. But, you know, sort of the others we're not going to know. So, you know, sort of it's really important for librarians and library staff to have confidence that the books matter. You know, it is really important that we curate a collection for every program that we do. Connect the collection, because that will connect that, you know, sort of aspirational reader goes, oh, I'm doing this. That might be useful. I'll grab that. You know, so and the same in the bookstore, Jaye, that Jaye's doing, that aspirational reader who's coming in with their child because they're an avid reader, or coming in with a friend and the friend is the reader, or the boyfriend coming in with a girlfriend and the girlfriend's the reader. You know, sort of that connecting them to something because they're actually interested in what they're doing in the library is really important. And we don't do it enough because we think the books are boring, you know, sort of. So, you know, this message that libraries are community hubs, which we absolutely are, but the reading and the connecting to Australian stories, you know, sort of that real connection to me. I can find me in stories is really important. And I think library staff need to have real confidence to connect the collection in everything that they do, and it's not boring.
No, definitely not. Comfort, inspiring, curiosity, learning, those are all the things that people associate with books already.
Yeah.
How they feel about reading. Let's lean into that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely lean into that. Now there's loads of chat, so much chat, lots coming through the Q&A. We did have a bit of a question about the link between literacy levels affecting reading behaviours. It's definitely part of the picture. I think we would see literacy levels as linking, Breanna, as one of the capability issues. So if the COMB model that you brought up earlier, where there are capability problems, motivational problems, opportunity problems, that would come up in the capability space for sure.
Yes, absolutely. So, and somebody has to have the skills to engage with the type of content that they want to engage with. So it absolutely fits under that capability aspect.
And so the work that we're doing here is about reading for pleasure. We did talk with people with a range of reading levels. We are almost certainly biased towards people who have a better reading level, but we have a whole range in the sample size, Breanna.
Yes, that's right. So there was, a very diverse sample, and we did have people reporting, that they had struggles with literacy, people with dyslexia participating. Because it was an online survey, we do need to be clear that, people did have to be able to read the survey to complete it. So that does bias our sample a little bit. There's not really a way around that, unfortunately. We just have to take it as a bit of a limitation. But we did definitely have, some of the sample representing people who had lower levels of literacy or other struggles. Some people had vision difficulties that prevented them from engaging with books and other kinds of those capability barriers.
So lots of kinds of different barriers were kind of considered and categorized during this sort of process. And we've also had a question around social media trends, which I think comes up very much around that social media comes up both from a social norm perspective, I'm guessing, Breanna, but also from that kind of trusted recommendation. This is coming from someone like me. It feels like those are the kinds of behavioural activity that's at work when we see the social media book talk type material working for some groups again.
Yes, and I'm sure to some people's disappointment, we didn't do a deep dive into book talk. That would be fascinating. Again, we had to have some barriers around the scope of the questions. But yes, what we see is probably, though, that engagement with book talk is probably a subset of avid and maybe some engaged readers who just can't get enough of books. They find it really interesting. They're probably getting a lot of their recommendations through book talk. I think what we want, if we're thinking about how we want our infrequent readers to engage, we might need to think about how book talk connects with those segments, and if there are other parts of social media that we can highlight books through that might connect with those people, thinking about how social norms work. So it might be that our ambivalent readers are really engaged with a different leisure activity, and maybe if we can get them to talk about the books that they read, that sends the right message, or that resonates in the right way with those segments. So we weren't able to delve into all of that complexity, but there's some considerations for how we might be able to leverage delivery mechanisms like social media to send those messages.
And another one that, like, I've been noticing, Breanna, and not just social media, but there's an enormous amount of Netflix and Apple TV new series that are based on quite old books, like Prime Target, sort of coming back. So, in terms of backlist titles that, but again, because that there's such a demand for content, they're going back to books to get the content. And I think then the flip to I want to read the book might work in that space too, particularly in young adult. They're doing quite a particular amount of young adult from books.
And so sorry, Breanna, there's lots that we could talk about, and Breanna and I have spent months talking, and I feel like it would be great if the industry had a hotline in some ways so that we can check which intervention is going to work best for this group. on a regular basis. I'm going to wrap up with our wonderful panel there. So I don't know if you know how to do if we can do the clapping emojis for our panel. Say thank you very much for them giving their time and going through the report at speed early on. There they come, all the clapping emojis, beautiful. Thank you very much to Jane, Jaye, Justin, and Eva. We are going to start to wrap today, because this is the next chapter of a conversation that has, as I said, been going for some time. We had the Volume National Reading Symposium in 2012. We had the National Year of Reading. These are all kind of components that have led us up to being able to do this piece of research. You've got the last couple of minutes while the chat threads are open to add any more questions that we didn't get to today, because we can look at what we might do for follow-up sessions and what kind of follow-up content we can provide around this report, which there's a lot that we can draw out of it over the coming months. There's a lot where we can start to talk about these segments as a whole industry together. Is what your program doing, developing the collection for aspirational readers? How are we going to get ambivalent readers along? Maybe some of my programs are only for avid readers, and I've never really thought that before, and now I want to diversify. So hopefully this material can give you and your colleagues the opportunity to have conversations with each other around what you can do at home, what you can do at work on a personal level, to look at growing engagement with these less engaged groups. Stay in touch with Australia Reads, because we will be producing follow-up information. You can download the full report, the summary, and all those juicy data tables. And we hope that you enjoy them. And I would also say that, so as well as those kind of individual conversations, if you're part of the Australia Reads newsletter, you'll see more about what are we going to do next? I mean, Justin's points there around what are the next steps for the industry? What does the next focused reading campaign look like? We've got this evidence base. We've got these recommendations on where we can have the greatest impact on literally millions of people. So how are we going to come together as an industry to look at what that next targeted, joint, shared initiative might look like? Is also an important question and conversation to continue across the year. So use and enjoy the report in your own setting, and stay part of the conversation about what we do at a national level to increase reading rates in Australia. Now, one final thing, we will be sending you a very short evaluation questionnaire to see how you're finding the report, how you found the event. When we ran the Volume National Reading Symposium, the questions and the responses that you gave us directly led to the commissioning of this research. So what you say does have an impact, and we do really want to hear from you. And really, we just want you to keep up the good work, enjoy sharing the love of books, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going. If you're part of the newsletter, we'll be sending out the link and recording to this event next week, so that you can share that with your colleagues. Thanks so much to all of you for all your time, and happy reading. Bye.